Hi there. This will act as part two of my discussion on Gnosticism and Wicca. And I wanted to make the point because I think some people may come back to me with this and think that I'm not aware of the definitional problem here. In the fact that, when I talk about Gnosticism, I'm talking about transcendentalism primarily, in the sense that there is another dimension beyond the dimensions of the demiurge, and the objective is to arrive in terms of consciousness at the transcendental dimension, transcending the dimensions of the demiurge. And I can see that this would be a different paradigm from Wicca, which is ostensibly either the worship of nature or of some kind of conception of the goddess and god, or of gods and goddesses of various ancient pantheons, such as the Greek or Roman or Celtic. And of course, this has to have the caveat is that a lot of Wiccans, in fact, take a more Jungian view of gods and goddesses and of nature spirits as being in the mind, and therefore Jungian archetypes. They take an archetypal view. So the gods and goddesses and nature spirits, etc., and spirits of the salt and everything that are cast out during the creation of a Wiccan circle. These things are not to be taken literally. They don't literally exist. They exist as parts of consciousness, discrete parts of the consciousness of the mind and of the collective unconscious, which people over modern years, over the last century, have tuned into, as it were, and have had a Gnostic experience of. They have had knowledge, they have gained knowledge of themselves to such an extent that they perceive of themselves as being either gods and goddesses of ancient pantheons or nature spirits. So that kind of complicates matters, as it were. It's not a simple matter, and you could say that that in itself is a transcendental model that Wiccans and neo-pagans are themselves using. So they're actually drawing on deep psychology of Jung in order to explain, in quotation marks, their religion to themselves and to others. But I think a lot of Wiccans do believe in nature spirits. They do believe in the immanence of the divine in nature, let us say. And that is quite different from a classical Gnostic view that there ain't nothing good about nature. Well, there ain't nothing transcendental about nature. There may be good in nature. There's good, bad, indifferent. I mean, there's creativity, there's preservation, and there's destruction in nature. So, of course, I suppose these categories transcend categories of good and evil. But certainly in classical Gnosticism, it's a bit more clear-cut than that. However, that's not really the point I wish to make, and I've got sort of distracted by these different points and different classifications of what Wiccans or some Wiccans do believe. And of course, Wicca is again very much a spectrum of beliefs and practices, norms and values. It's not one church or one spiritual movement. So in that sense, it's a bit like Gnosticism, in fact, because Gnosticism is a spectrum of beliefs, practices, norms, values, and beliefs that go from classical influences right up to Buddhist influences. And the belief in karma, for example, which a lot of Wiccans also believe in as well. So in fact, actually, Wiccans and Gnostics have more in common, ostensibly, than they have in terms of difference, really. Perhaps my last video created more difference between Gnosticism and Wicca than in fact actually practically exists. or exists within the communities of Gnosticism and Wicca, which is also an interesting point. But again, I'm becoming even more digressed, because my point is that in terms of gnosis, receiving of knowledge, I mean, a Wiccan could say that they received knowledge of the immanence of the divine in nature as a result of looking at a tree or a flower one day. And the thought popped into their mind that nature is divine, and that divine is immanent in nature, and that that nature can be called upon to create positive, miraculous events and interventions as a result of the placation of nature spirits, or even of the gods and goddesses of the ancient pantheons, which are merely extensions of nature spirits. Where one thinks of the god Mars being originally an agricultural god, and therefore an extension of nature. It was only later that he became a capital god of war and conquest with the Roman Empire. And so so it's a very complicated issue, and perhaps I've made it far too simplistic in my presentation. So in terms of the mechanism of gnosis, in that you're walking along one day wherever, and an experience happens to you which is unique, which is an experience of the divine, and then you look at the divine either as completely transcendental or immanent in nature. And obviously, if you're going to have a Gnostic experience, you are going to experience it in this dimension, in the material world. A Wiccan or neo-pagan could certainly argue that they are Gnostic in the sense that they have had unique individual revelations and experiences of the divine. They haven't received it from a book or a guru. And indeed, they would argue that books and gurus have absolutely no place in Wicca. There are sort of standard texts now at this stage, with the sort of third generation of Wiccans, as it were, but they're only texts are only guidelines, and everything is open to individual interpretation anyway. So there's no kind of slavish adherence to a book, or even a guru, or even if you join a coven, there's no slavish adherence to the living god or the living goddess, the priest and the priestess of the coven. And covens are very eclectic, and covens are very individualistic as well. And insofar as Gnosticism could be described as an individualistic spiritual path, well, so is Wicca as well. As far as I might say the mechanism of gnosis, many people will claim the mechanism of gnosis, or they claim that they have received a Gnostic experience, which makes them a generic Gnostic in that sense of the word. And you could be a Muslim, you could be a Buddhist, you could be anything, you could be any religion. And you have had an individual experience of that religion. You're not just following that religion as a tradition within your family or community, you see, which a lot of people do. A lot of people follow religion out of a wish to adhere to a tradition in the family and the community, and even a political tradition and a political interpretation of their religion. And their religion stands for a certain political view and a certain package of norms, values, and beliefs. Norms and values principally. They don't really want or care or need individual gnosis of their religion. They're quite content to follow a guru or a text to the letter and interpret it, in fact, morally and humanistically rather than mystically. That has to be borne in mind. But in terms of, and it almost seems to me, though, that as a result of thinking about this, that you'd almost say that, there are gnosis there are Gnostics and Gnostics. There are Gnostics that do believe in the scripture do believe in Gnostic scriptures, and perhaps follow a teacher of Gnosis like Stefan Heuler, for example, and and hang on his every word. Perhaps there are not many people who would say that exactly, but it's not like having a guru in Hinduism, for example, or in Buddhism, for example. In Tibetan Buddhism, you'd have a guru, and you'd hang on their every word and every gesture and every request as well. It's important to note, you see, that the requests that a guru makes of you are also spiritually significant, because they may be requests that bring out a certain side of your character which you didn't know existed, and this is part of the spiritual path. Anyway, I digress greatly there. So, in my last video, it was kind of reductionist view of Wicca and Gnosis and Gnosticism. But all I'm saying is that if you adhere to classical Gnosticism, and you really are a transcendentalist at heart, and you really do have an indifferent attitude, to say the least, to the realms of the demiurge, as you have identified them or labelled them, then you are going to be at odds, well, not at odds, but certainly different from the Wiccan paradigm. And in that sense, you're going to have to somehow reconcile, if you want to reconcile Wicca with Gnosticism, or of course you may not want to reconcile Wicca with Gnosticism. You may, in fact, rather like Stefan Heuler, be somewhat, dare I say, cynical of the worship of nature, which he has expressed often in his homilies, you see. But I think nowadays, the barriers between definitions are getting broken down more and more as eclecticism and individualism increase. So the fuzzy edges between definition, between Gnostic and Wicca and Buddhist and Hermeticist and alchemist and Christian and Hindu and Buddhist and I said Buddhist and Muslim, they are breaking down. They are really breaking down. Well, they're breaking down on one hand, but there's also more religious fundamentalism on the other, which is a contradiction that one would expect, really, from being in the lower worlds, quite frankly. As another one of the characteristics of the worlds or of the demiurge is contradiction and self-contradiction, and the fact that we go into self-contradiction and ultimately into silence, from which, of course, silence, we hear the voice, which is the voice of Gnosis. So it goes round and round, So do not despair about contradiction and self-contradiction. You go into it, and then you go from there into silence, and then you go from there to Gnosis. Now, how that leads you in relation to other religions, it might leave you in a slight, dare I say, a negative relationship with external religion. You might not really be so bothered with external religion. You might also regret very much that religion has been politicized and tribalized over the centuries or thousands of years. And you might point out that true religion is an individual experience per se, rather than a collective experience which leads inevitably to an in-group and an out-group, and feelings of superiority to the out-group, and feelings that you're better than other people because you believe X, Y, and Z, and that is an unfortunate development. Another characteristic of the lower worlds is tribalism, and tribalism and division between peoples on the basis of what they believe. So we don't want to go down that route either. So when you talk about Gnosticism, as opposed to Gnosis. You talk about Gnosticism, and they talk about the transcendental religion, which is based on the Gnostic scriptures. Then, in fact, I suppose you're talking about a sort of different animal to Gnosis. And I think it's an important distinction to make because whereas Gnosticism, which is based on Gnostic scriptures, might have a lot of differences between it and Islam, for example, or it and Wicca, or it and Buddhism. If you're talking about Gnosis, then you're talking about a much more ecumenical animal, as it were, roaming around the consciousness of mankind. And that you may want to look at it from that point of view rather than from a more sort of from a more classical Gnostic point of view, or Gnosticism as in the classical sense of the religion. But we are here to celebrate our differences as well as what unites us. So we should not sacrifice our differences in order to have some sort of unity, which is a false unity. We should recognize the things that we have in common and the things that we don't have in common, and explore the things that we don't have in common as vigorously as the things that we do have in common. And I think that a balance of that as a sort of methodology of studying your own religious beliefs or your own spirituality in relation to other people, that is a good thing. That is a balanced thing. That is a thing which doesn't deny differences or similarities, you see. And of course, ultimately, you're going to say, well, we're all human beings anyway. So we should not create division between human beings. And yet also we do have to recognize there are divisions between human beings, and we don't all have to be forced into the same hole. When we don't have to be all battered together to form a united peg to be shoved into one size hole. We are different shaped pegs, and we do fit different shaped holes. But within the whole structure of it, of course, obviously, we are united by our humanity and our tolerance of each other. But anyway, I didn't really want my first video on Gnosticism and Wicca, didn't want to create division between Wiccans and Gnostics, as it were. As I said, as I've explained, Gnosis actually is an umbrella term which basically covers all religions that have ever been and ever will be, in terms of the mechanics of personal individual revelation. But all I'm saying is that there is a tradition in Gnosticism which comes from a different point than the tradition which is implicit in quite the modern religion of Wicca. And people say Wicca is a modern New Age religion, but it is now somewhat, well, it's about 100 years old now. And at what point, does a religion go from a new religious movement to being an old religious movement? It's 100 years old and drawing on religions that are hundreds, thousands of years old, and shamanistic traditions which are tens of thousands of years old. So that's another thing, another point to bear in mind as well. Anyway, so I sort of present these arguments in a slightly embarrassed mood, embarrassed frame of mind, because, I recognize a lot of people might not like my last video on Gnosticism Wicca. And anyway, we'll disagree and think I've been a bit too reductionist, a bit too second order studying. I've taken too much of a second order methodology, and I should keep to my own Gnostic beliefs and not try and compare them to other people's beliefs. But as I said, nowadays there's so much eclecticism. There's so much, that people are sort of stirring in so many different religious traditions into the same pot. as it were, and the pot is very much an individual pot as well, the individual cauldron for everybody. And so it becomes increasingly difficult to sort of categorize, and it becomes also somewhat redundant and somewhat academic and perhaps somewhat I've forgotten the sort of word for it now. It's become, well, it's certainly become a redundant methodology. Let us put it that way. It's not a very useful methodology. And yet, I still think that to point out the difference between thinking about the divine being immanent in nature and the divine being transcendental to nature is a significant contemplation. It is important because obviously it does somewhat change the package of norms, values, and beliefs that you do as an individual take on board, you see. So I think, as I don't think my methodology is entirely redundant, but you might say, well, I don't think this is a useful conversation to have at all. In which case, you're not going to be interested in any further conversations of this sort. So I think I'll draw a line underneath the whole of this discussion now, really, as far as I'm concerned, and to let you make up your own mind about these issues that I've raised.